Do you ever find yourself saying yes when you really mean no? And then you go away feeling resentful because you wish that you could backtrack and get out of an obligation that you're now even more stressed out about? Well, if this happens to you, you're not alone. Most of us struggle with setting limits, even when we know we're exhausted and overwhelmed.
In this episode, we talk about why saying no feels so hard, what research says about boundaries, and how learning to say no can actually lead to healthier relationships, a lot less stress, and a more meaningful yes. Join us for a conversation about guilt, people pleasing, and the freedom that comes when we learn to set healthy boundaries.
Do you sometimes feel lost in your relationships, your identity, or even your spirituality? Welcome to Gilmore Green, where healing and hope meet.
We are marriage and family therapists and relationship experts who care deeply about helping you grow, strengthen your relationships, and deepen your sense of meaning and spirituality.
We long to share from our clinical experience, years of training and solid research, including ideas about how to strengthen the things that matter the most to all of us in life.
We're so glad you're here. Our hope is to share simple, meaningful ideas that support you in your healing and in your growth. Welcome to Gilmore and Green, where healing and hope meet. Hi, I'm Dr. Debi Gilmore, a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Sharilyn Green, also a marriage and family therapist. And today we're going to talk about something that almost everyone struggles with at some point, learning how to say no.
Most of us know, at least intellectually, that it's okay to say no. We even tell other people they should do it. But when that moment actually arrives, when someone asks for our time, our help, or our energy, suddenly it becomes a lot harder. And sometimes we say yes when we really do mean no. Then later we find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, maybe even a little resentful, and sometimes just plain exhausted. So today, we want to talk about two things. First, why saying no is healthy and important. And second, why it can feel so uncomfortable to do so. Let's start with a simple truth. Every yes costs you something. Yeah, that's true. When you say yes to one thing, you're automatically saying no to something else. Your time, your energy, your rest, or sometimes even the people closest to you. And here's something important to remember. Healthy boundaries are not selfish. They actually are what make healthy relationships possible. When people can be honest about their limits, there tends to be less resentment and a lot more authenticity in the relationship.
Yeah, Debbie, I noticed how often you use the word healthy as you were just talking and describing this. It doesn't feel healthy to us sometimes, right? It feels selfish and other things. So I really loved listening to you talk about it in those terms, that it really is healthy to do this. And so when someone starts saying yes out of pressure or guilt, eventually we know within ourselves, even, and then in our work, that something starts to wear down inside, right? And you may have felt this before. You keep showing up for everyone else, but over time you start to feel invisible, drained, and maybe even a little resentful. So learning to say no really is about learning to respect your own capacity. And that capacity is different for each of us, right? It's not the same. We each have different capacities. We all have limits emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And sometimes saying no is exactly what protects our ability to give meaningful yeses to the things that matter most. So, if saying no is healthy, why does it feel so hard? And there's actually several reasons we want to talk about today. And one of those reasons is that we often have, it's probably the biggest fear in this, that we're going to disappoint people, right? We learn pretty early on in life that approval or love or acceptance comes when we're helpful, accommodating, and easy to be around. There's a lot of messages that teach us that belief and that concept. And so that's one of the major reasons it's so hard to say no to people.
Yeah, you mentioned we want to make sure we don't disappoint anyone, or we might be one of those what we would call a people pleaser. I am one of those. I hate saying no because I want to make sure that anytime someone asks for something from me, I have in my mind, well, if I say yes, then they'll like me better. We get stuck in that. And that's actually it. When people hear us say no, they have a high respect for us. How did you do that? That's really awesome that you can say no and not feel badly about it. So it kind of backfires for us. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But another reason saying no can feel so hard is that it can trigger our attachment system. What do we mean by that? Well, we're wired for connection. So when we imagine disappointing someone, part of us worries, maybe even subconsciously, that we might damage that connection, as I suggested a minute ago. That resonates with me. Because of that, even a small request can bring up some anxiety inside. Some people also worry about how they'll be perceived by others if they say no. They don't want to be seen as selfish, rude, or even difficult, inflexible. And for people who genuinely care about others, saying no can feel like you're letting someone down. For many people, especially those that are natural helpers or caregivers or professionals in service roles, being dependable is part of their identity. I've noticed this in my friends who are nurses. They seem to always be saying, yes, I can do that. I would be happy to do that. It's in their nature. It's a gift. You're the person people can count on. So saying no can almost feel like you're going against who you are. And then there's the discomfort of conflict. Saying no can sometimes create tension, and a lot of people would rather carry the stress themselves than risk upsetting someone else. But here's the interesting paradox. When people never say no, relationships often become less healthy, not more. Over time, people can start feeling taken advantage of or taken for granted, overwhelmed, or even quietly resentful.
Yeah, Debbie, every reason you just gave and talked about why it's hard to say no resonated with me too. It's something that we all struggle with. But I think what you said at the very end, it really does create unhealthy relationships in the end. That's the part that's sometimes hard to remember in all of this. And so when people learn to communicate their limits with kindness and clarity, something really different actually starts to happen. Relationships become more honest. They're more authentic. They're more real when we can do that, right? People now know where they stand with each other. And over time, and it may take a little bit of time to make these adjustments when we've been doing things that aren't necessarily as healthy as we'd like, respect, though, tends to grow. And so it helps us if we can start thinking about it this way. As you've said, every time we say yes to something, we forget that we're also quietly saying no to something else. We often don't add that second part to the yes, right? If I say yes to this, that means something else has to go. But you might be saying no to your rest. You might be saying no to time with your family, or you may be saying no to the things that really matter most to you. I have a sister who models this perfectly. She tells me all the time that she has certain practices in place every day. And if anything starts to interfere with that, she's just diligent about protecting those things that are so important to her. I've watched her over the years do such a good job of this. As I'm talking about it, I'm thinking of her. Learning to say no isn't about being selfish. It's about being intentional with your life. That's really what it's about. Because when your yes comes from freedom instead of pressure, right? That is a lot of the reason we say yes is pressure. Instead of our own intention and freedom, it becomes something much more meaningful and actually becomes a gift instead of something that's given with resentment.
And maybe even, I love that you brought up that it's a gift. It's a gift to us and those that we interact with. I'm thinking about the times when we say yes and really mean no, and then later end up canceling or backing out somehow. That becomes a trend. And then our friends, or even us, when I think about the others that have done that to me, I start to trust them less. I don't know if their yes actually means yes. And so the gift that we give when we can balance and weigh the cost and benefit in a healthy way, we're actually considering what will benefit our connection best. What's the gift I can give? If I had to say no, that's actually a gift because they know that they can count on me. So that's the kind of yes that really builds a meaningful life. Sometimes a healthy no can sound very simple. And think about it. This is what we don't think about. Here's a way to practice in the mirror, something like, I wish I could help, but I'm not able to right now. Or I won't be able to take that on. I'm going to need to pass on that this time. I even like to suggest that when someone asks us if we can do something, to say, wow, thank you for asking me. I will get back to you. I want to give it some thought. But one thing I often suggest is that when someone asks you to take something on that feels outside your capacity, or maybe it's not really in your wheelhouse, so to speak, you don't need to explain yourself. In fact, I suggest you don't. You don't need a long explanation. You don't need to defend your decision. A clear, concise, and respectful no is enough. In fact, when we start explaining too much, we often start rationalizing, and before we know it, we're slipping back into saying yes out of guilt. So if you think about times when you've heard someone say no without a long explanation, maybe you've felt even a little admiration for them, like I brought up earlier. You might have thought, how are they able to say that so confidently? There's something about that clarity that people tend to respect. A gentle reframe might help here too. Let me just say, sometimes saying no is simply protecting your ability to show up fully where it matters most, to show up for your family, to show up for your health, and to show up for the commitments that are truly a priority and important to you and your loved ones. Because when everything becomes a yes, the things that matter most often end up getting the leftovers. And none of us really want to live that way.
I love the way you talked about saying, "Can I think about this for a minute too?" Sometimes as we strengthen this muscle that we practice this ability to say no, it buys us time to do that. We're not on the spot. You can ask for a little bit of time too to come back with this no that feels more comfortable for you, because saying no really is uncomfortable for us, right? And as we talk about this, we know that all of us struggle with this, and that you are not alone in any difficulties of saying no. It's something that a lot of us are still learning, and the good news is that it really is a skill, and it gets easier with practice. Debbie, we love the research on things, right? We're always looking at that. And interestingly enough, psychology research has actually looked quite a bit into, of course, we know assertiveness of boundaries and the ability to say no. And the findings there really do support and reinforce how important it is to be able to set limits without feeling guilty. And so, one interesting finding has to do with actually how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired to avoid social rejection. We're deeply wired for belonging and connection. And so, the research in social neuroscience shows us that when people experience social rejection, the brain actually activates some of the same regions that process physical pain. I think that's so interesting.
Yeah,
So,
I actually do too. I was thinking, as much as I love the science of the brain, when we can connect it to how is this a benefit to me and my loved ones and relationships, if our brain is signaling physical pain, which it truly does, we experience emotional pain or discomfort, our brain sends the message that it is someplace on our body that is physically in distress. And so wouldn't you think then that our brain is serving as a protective factor to say, hang on, wait a sec.
yeah, and also makes us understand why it again is so hard to say no,
Yeah.
right? As that pain comes, that fear of rejection can be so subtle in us, and so it makes sense. I love that.
That's one reason saying no can feel so uncomfortable. It's not a weakness. Your brain is simply trying to protect connection. Isn't that interesting? This amazing computer in our bodies that is protecting us and protecting not only connection, but our sense of belonging. In fact, part of the discomfort comes from the fact that our brains experience potential rejection in the form of physical pain. So saying no is linked to better mental health. At the same time, research shows that learning to be assertive, being able to communicate limits and say no, has benefits for our overall mental health and well being. Studies have found that people who develop stronger assertiveness skills often experience lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of stress, and depression. They also tend to report higher self worth. and less psychological distress overall. So, in many ways, learning to say no isn't just helpful for relationships, it's actually good for your own well being too. In simple terms, people who feel comfortable saying no tend to be less overwhelmed and more emotionally healthy. Isn't that our goal? Isn't that what we all long for?
Yes, and I'm going to continue your thoughts about boundaries because they also protect against something that we all struggle and deal with too, and that's burnout, right? Research also consistently shows that when people don't have clear boundaries, they're much more likely to experience this emotional exhaustion. I think we all recognize in ourselves. And so, without those limits, it's really easy for life to start feeling overwhelming. My goodness, we live in such a world with so many options and things. It's so easy to get overwhelmed. And we all can end up dealing with burnout, anxiety, as you talked about, and just this kind of constant sense of emotional overload. I would have to say that's something that I think most of humanity is really facing and trying to manage, right? Is this emotional overload that we all feel. And so, this ability to say no is such a protective factor to your time, your energy, and your priorities. It will actually, of course, reduce that overwhelm that is so natural in our world to feel and helps prevent that kind of slow buildup of chronic stress. It is a slow buildup. Sometimes we don't even recognize how much stress that we're under. And so, this is the reason why we as therapists often talk about boundaries as a form of self care, not selfishness. As we've talked about, it continues to strengthen our relationships and improve them in a way that you may not feel at first, right? It can be difficult to make this transition sometimes. But when people learn to communicate their limits in respectful ways, it will create more balance and more mutual respect in your relationships because actually both people's needs matter. I love what you said when you say yes and then you cancel on something, it reduces trust in our relationship. That's just such a perfect example of how it impacts ourselves, but also our relationships. And
Yeah, as it occurs to me as we're thinking about protecting relationships, we're also protecting a relationship with ourself. So boundaries also protect relationships from slipping into what we would call negative cycles or unhealthy patterns where one person ends up carrying too much of the responsibility. In many ways, healthy relationships actually depend on something simple, honest limits. So, people pleasing, I see this so much in my work. People who want so much to be loved and to have a sense of belonging. So, they are more likely to say yes more often than they should to overcome that idea of having a sense of not belonging. Research on people pleasing actually shows that constantly saying yes can come with some emotional costs. People who feel a strong need to keep everyone happy, we're going to die trying actually, but when we feel like we need to keep everyone happy, we experience more emotional distress and sometimes have a harder time regulating our emotions. So we must be focused on that, be more aware of the dangers of people pleasing. When someone avoids conflict all the time or tries to and struggles to be assertive, it can slowly chip away at their sense of self respect and leaves them feeling powerless. Over time, always saying yes can quietly undermine a person's well being.
yeah, we're talking, like you said, about our relationship with ourself. Sometimes we forget about that critical relationship with self, right? We do tend to worry and emphasize our relationship with others. And so boundaries really are such a key to maintaining this healthy sense of self. In the research on personal boundaries, it also shows how important that is for psychological balance. Being able to express limits helps people maintain a healthier balance between their own needs and the needs of others. That can be out of balance, right? When we are constantly saying yes. And that balance tends to support both stronger relationships and better mental health in us. So, in simple terms, again, boundaries help people stay connected to others and while staying true to themselves, to that important self relationship. We often worry or we overestimate how upset other people will be. I've actually done this and you do it and it's like, "Oh, wow, that went well." Interesting finding from research is that studies show that people who consistently overestimate how upset others will be when they say no When they were asked to kind of predict how someone would react if they declined a request, they usually did imagine that the reaction was going to be much more negative than it actually turned out to be. That's actually good to remember when you're worried about that. So, in other words, people often imagine anger when we say no, but in reality, most people really do respond with far more understanding than we expect. And as you've talked about, even a deeper admiration and respect for us. So it's helpful to remember that our minds tend to create a much bigger emotional consequence than what actually happens when we say no and set boundaries with people.
Yeah, this term disappointment, this normal human experience of disappointment, we like to teach in our work that disappointment needs to be something we cultivate in ourselves to be able to tolerate. And when we can do that, we become much more flexible overall in our world. When we sense disappointment, we see that as, oh, that was disappointing. I'm so disappointed. We teach that in parenting. When parents can say, I'm so disappointed, but I still love you, then that really, that mixture of the positive and the disappointment is motivating instead of crushing. So I just like to teach experience disappointment. When you see it, welcome it. Ask, why am I disappointed? It's okay. But saying yes actually gives a short term reward. It's not lasting, it doesn't build resilience, actually. Here's another interesting thing that researchers have found: helping other people actually activates the brain's reward system. It triggers a release of dopamine that we all love, that rush of dopamine, the same chemical linked to pleasure and satisfaction. So when we help someone, it feels good. And that's a beautiful part of being human. But here's the catch: that short term reward can sometimes make it easier to ignore the long term cost of exhaustion, overwhelm, or eventual burnout. So people may keep saying yes because it feels good in the moment, even when it creates stress later on. In other words, sometimes we say yes because it gives us an immediate emotional reward or a fix, even if it quietly drains us over time. Years ago, a mother came in for help, and I didn't know exactly why she was there in my office, but the minute she sat down, she crumbled into sobs. I was surprised. I waited a minute to allow her to just pour her heart out, but she was so ashamed that she didn't want to be a mother anymore. I was stunned. She had two very young little children, and she said she was absolutely overwhelmed. She did not like who she had become because she was extremely irritable with everyone, including her husband and those little children. After asking her a few probing questions just to understand more about what she was experiencing, she told me that she had spent most of her life being the person who always said yes. If someone needed help, she said yes. If someone asked for her time, she said yes. If someone needed her to step in, to stay late, to fix something or take care of something, she said yes. She liked that people described her as incredibly kind, incredibly dependable. But she again repeated, I am just so tired. Her calendar was always full. Her days were packed, and deep down, she felt like she was disappearing inside of everyone else's needs. Then one day, recently, something happened that shook her. Her 8-year-old daughter asked her a compelling question: Mommy, why are you always helping everyone else, but you're always too busy to sit with me? Now, interestingly, her daughter was not angry or even pressuring, not accusing, just painfully curious. And the mother said that that question pierced her heart because she realized something painful in that moment. She had been saying yes to so many things that she had been unintentionally saying no to the very people who mattered most, her sweet little 8-year-old. Now, that was the moment when everything shifted for her, and she realized, I need help. We talked about the fact that saying no isn't selfish, but it's self compassion that protects and preserves her so she can be helpful to others in moderation. Now, over time, she didn't stop caring about people, but she began to protect her time more carefully. She began to pause before automatically saying yes. And, Sherilyn, as I met with this beautiful woman and the insights started to come in, she was able to say something like, I wish I could help, but I'm not available right now. I'm not able to. And it was uncomfortable for her at first, but over time, something beautiful happened to her. She had more energy, more peace, more presence with the people she loved. Now, let me qualify this was over time in working with her. We had to revisit this, and every once in a while she'd come back in. And I'm sure, Sherilyn, have you had clients like that? Yeah.
Right now, yes. Hmm.
Yeah. And so why did she have more peace, more love, more presence with people? Because she realized something important. Every yes shapes a life. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do for our own families and relationships, for ourselves, is to learn how to say no. And I think it's especially important to remember this: saying no doesn't make you unkind, it doesn't make you selfish. Sometimes saying no is exactly what allows you to live with more integrity, more peace, and more genuine connection.
Wow, I love that story, Debbie. Yeah, I'm thinking just as you talk that I'm also working with a client in the very same situation, and she's in such burnout that she's actually numb. She can hardly feel anything anymore. And I'm watching her wake up. She came and she says, I have not felt this happy in years because she is finally choosing compassion for herself, saying no to things. She has really important decisions to make. She wasn't even in a place where she could make them because she was so burned out. And so I'm thinking about this beautiful client as you're talking. And the interesting thing too is that when we say yes, we often take away the opportunity for other people to grow in the ways they may need to as well, right? And she found that she wasn't creating the space for other people to grow in the ways they needed. She was doing it for them. And so it was, again, back to this, how it affects our relationships, right? It was affecting the other person's growth, and it was exhausting and burning her out. So if we step back and just look at the big picture, the research gives us a pretty clear takeaway to this, doesn't it? That people who are able to say no and set healthy boundaries really are able to experience lower stress and anxiety, higher self-esteem, less burnout, healthier relationships, and then stronger personal boundaries overall. At the same time, research can also help explain why saying no can be so hard. And we've talked about that today, that our brains are wired to fear rejection. We tend to overestimate how upset other people will be. And honestly, saying yes can feel rewarding in the moment. There's that dopamine hit that feels pretty good. It gets us out of conflict, even, or some hard things in the moment, but the long term cost is great. So when we put all of this together, it makes sense that saying no can really feel uncomfortable for all of these really great reasons, but that discomfort is actually very human and very normal. And there's a cost that's even greater than the long-term peace and health and well-being that comes when we have these limits in our life.
Wow, thank you for putting that in a summary, all in a nutshell. Hopefully, what we've outlined today is helping you realize the benefits of being able to weigh things with more intention, being more aware. So, thank you for summarizing all of that, Sherilyn. We're kind of there right now, the therefore what? And I think I identified mine very early in this podcast, realizing that I don't want to disappoint others. And yet I preach that to my clients. Don't be a people pleaser. But naturally, if we love helping, we might slip into this slippery slope of saying yes too much. And then you pointed out something I think is my therefore what, to consider: if I can say no, who else will benefit when they're able to say yes? It's a good timing for them. So that's mine. I'm going to be more aware and weigh out the cost and benefits.
Yeah, and this has been a good reminder for me. We are both therapists in the helping profession. We are naturally inclined to help people. That's certainly my nature. I think my favorite word in the English language is balance. So for me, it's a balance of, it's of course it's important to help people, but it has to be done in a way that honors yourself, doesn't abandon yourself in doing it. And so I'm going to be more confident, I think, going forward because of what we talked about today. As we go over the reasons, there's so much value in saying no instead of yes to things all the time. I'm really glad we've been able to talk about this today.
Yes, me too. And thank you so much to our listeners. We hope you will continue to follow us. And if you get a minute, send us some ideas for topics you would like us to cover.
Love hearing from you. Take care, everyone.